Today's OTA changes have some good news and they have some bad news. To rip the band-aid off, we've got a nerf to Angela, a buff to Alioth, but then we're going to top it off with Hercules finally getting what could be a meaningful change. Let's go ahead and dive into it, shall we? Angela is once again taking a crack from the Nerf bat. She will now be a 2/3 that gets +1 power again after a card is played to her location. Second Inner justifies this change by sharing with us that there were some weeks where Angela decks exceeded 20% of all games played, while simultaneously being the best deck in that sample size. That's definitely a very impressive stat, and there's no doubt about it that the addition of Athena to the game definitely improved the Angela Kitty Pride package a good deal. Second Inner goes on to articulate that the group of cards around Angela had homogenized a lot in the recent weeks as well. So it wasn't simply Angela, Kitty, and Athena going into a variety of decks. They were sharing a ton of core cards. Specifically, other things that move around like Jeff and Nocturne were being played with these other few in a variety of decks, making them all very similar in this large metagame share. There's no sugarcoating my feelings with regards to this change. It makes me a little bit sad. I think the Angela, Kitty Pride, Athena core cards that start cheap and scale up while you make key sequencing decisions over the course of the match are some of the most interesting, skill testing, and best cards to have be good in Snap. In the past, Angela at only +1 had not been good enough, but her base power had never been as high as 3 to start, so perhaps this iteration of Angela in tandem with Athena now being in the game will allow her to still be competitive. It's also worth noting that Shadow King's been rising in popularity in part due to these Angela Athena decks, and Angela having base power to begin with now means that his impact against her is going to be a little bit less than it was before. In an attempt to be at least a little bit objective here, I will acknowledge that this nerf almost does assuredly make sense. I'm just hoping that Angela can still remain a powerful and relevant card in this latest iteration, because I think when Angela decks are good, Marvel Snap's metagame overall tends to be in a better spot. The Angela change is actually the only nerf in today's OTA, and that doesn't really surprise me. I've been saying a lot recently that the current metagame feels great, definitely one of the more diverse and interesting that Snap has ever had. That being said, our first buff I want to cover today is a bit of a doozy. Alioth is going from a 6/8 up to a 6/10. The justification for this change is relatively straightforward. They want to increase Alioth's power to improve its performance. Second Inner goes on to say that when they had originally redesigned Alioth to its current text box, they wanted to err on the side of it being a little bit weaker because they wanted the card to just not show up as much as it had been. It was both powerful, prevalent, and very frustrating in its previous iteration. They say that 6/10 they think is a healthier stat line in the long term, and they view Alioth as an important tool for providing counterplay to things such as Odin decks, which have been getting more popular lately, both in the form of Silver Surfer variations as well as Nomura combo decks that have been running around. As far as my personal feelings are concerned, it's definitely no secret that I hated the old version of Alioth. The new one is definitely less offensive, but that's also because it was a lot less popular. I'm going to be curious to see how this plays out overall. It's worth noting that the 6/8 version of Alioth in our public tracker stats on Untapped has a fairly poor win rate, but also has a fairly high cube rate because the games where it's winning, it tends to blow your opponent out for a lot of big wins. I hope that this card doesn't become popular again, but it's simply going to be a wait and see type thing, how the metagame adjusts around this change. Our next change is an objectively happy one. Hercules is being changed to a 3/4 while maintaining the text the first time another card moves here each turn. Move it to another location. Second Inner starts their justification for this change by noting that when they made the change to how cards move a few weeks ago, it actually didn't have as dramatic of an effect on move cards in general, going on to note that even Phoenix Force has been seeing some good performances. I don't think it's a coincidence that Phoenix Force and other move decks still being reasonable after the mood change is almost assuredly related to the fact that Professor X was meaningfully changed in that same patch, and Professor X not being involved in, 20 or 25% or whatever amount of the games is a much larger boon to move cards overall than the small move stage changing was in terms of being detrimental. They do go on to articulate, however, that a handful of move cards have seen worse performance as a result of that change, and Hercules is among them, so they're going to be buffing him and a number of others in today's update. Personally, I'm very happy to see Hercules move to a 3 energy card. He's obviously going to be just better than he was before inside of these move shells, and from curve consideration, he fits much better into what a lot of these decks are trying to do. A specific line that comes to mind is being able to play Hercules on 3 will now curve really cleanly into a Vulture plus a Ghost Spider or an Iron Fist plus a Vulture on turn 4, letting you cleanly ping-pong that Vulture around the board, letting it get really big for minimal investment. While I'm not sure if this change is going to be enough to make Hercules or even the move deck as a whole relevant, I'm definitely excited to incinerate a bunch of cubes trying to figure that out. Our next move-related card to get a sizable buff is Kingpin. He's going from a 2-3 down to a 1-2, while retaining his triggered ability when an enemy card moves here, afflict it with -2 power. Second Editor notes that Kingpin did take a big hit with the change to how cards move, so they're going to see if a more efficient cost can improve the card's performance. Landing it earlier will allow Kingpin to slide into curves better, and a 1 energy card fits much easier on later turns than a 2 energy card does. I think it's easy to underestimate at a glance just how big of a change reducing a card's cost by 1 power is, and this Kingpin change really feels like a big one. Specifically, something that comes to mind is you'll now be able to curve Kingpin on 1 into Kraven on 2 into Polaris or Spider-Man on turn 3, giving you flexibility to where you drag your opponent's cards around the board to always generate a little bit of extra value from your cards that punish your opponent for doing so. Personally, I'm really happy to see this change to Kingpin. I think he already felt like a kind of weak card even before they made him strictly worse with the changing to how move cards are staged a few weeks ago, and I'm hopeful that maybe this will finally be the push that makes Stegron playable. Huh? Our next movement change is a minor one to Miles Morales, pushing him up to a 4-6 when he previously was a 4-5. This change is one that I specifically have asked for in recent weeks. Miles definitely feels like he's been power crept by other more powerful cost reducers like Mockingbird, and I think this stat boost is relatively free. I don't expect him to become a top metagame card by any means, but giving a extra point to a card that's struggling is definitely one of those free changes that feels good to see happen. Our next buff has High Evolutionary going from a 4-4 up to a 4-6. Second Editor notes that High Evolutionary decks have definitely slid from their once prominent peak. They don't expect this buff to change that, but they always like to add power wherever possible when they can add some stats to a struggling archetype. They also go on to say that they're looking into other changes to positively impact High Evolutionary overall. You should stay tuned for those in the future. I'm inclined to agree with their assessment. These seem like free stats that also probably aren't going to meaningfully move the needle, and how playable High Evolutionary is as a card. I'm going to be curious to see what steps they take to push this card back to being more relevant, since the introduction of Red Hulk to the format especially created a pretty powerful and natural competitor for this archetype that was already on the downswing. Finally, we have a single stat point buff to Nick Fury going from a 4-5 up to a 4-6. They note that Nick's been underplayed for a while and has room to gain power without it making him disruptive. They think that him having 6 power while generating 6 cost cards also looks very elegant from a numbers perspective, and I'm inclined to agree. They go on to say that long term, they're optimistic that they can hopefully give players more reasons to choose to play Nick Fury over more efficient card generation like Agent Coulson that we see those decks typically play. Personally, Nick's a card that I've always enjoyed, and it's interesting to see how his power level goes up or down with the introduction of new 6-drops to the game, expanding his output range a little bit. I want to be curious to see exactly how Second Editor can make him specifically more appealing without making adjustments to the cards in future designs. Overall, really solid OTA update today. Even if I would have preferred Angela not get nerfed, there's no denying that her stats definitely justify her getting a little bit shaved off the top. I'm also really happy to see Second Dinner not just be complacent with a metagame that feels good and choosing to buff a number of cards that are previously struggling to give us new toys to explore and play with while we get to continue to enjoy all the other things that are already in the format and playable. As always, I'd love to hear which of these cards you're excited to brew with and what you plan to play them in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed my breakdown on this topic, be sure to snap that like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel to not miss any game news updates here many times per week.